Now, Shay Barnes, I'm delighted to have you on the podcast, No Sex Please, I'm Religious. And Shay, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's pretty early for you, isn't it? Is it in London?
It's quite early. No, I'm not in London. I'm in the Forest of Dean, which is a very beautiful place, actually quite away from London, probably 3, 4 hours from London,
Oh, wow.
right on the border with Wales. Very, very, very beautiful part of the UK. We have one of the largest forests in the country. And
Wow.
I'm looking out there because right at the end of my road are deer, foxes, badgers, boar, beavers, pine martens.
Oh,
Yeah, it's lovely.
fantastic. What a lovely place to live. Well,
Yeah, it is really
I love the
rather special.
scenery around where you live. Beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, it is really gorgeous.
Shay, I've been following you on LinkedIn for quite a while, and I'm actually amazed at the responses that people are giving you to your talks, and the content of your talks. It just astounds me, really. So, I looking at your profile, you introduce yourself, and you say that you were born as a woman, but you never actually questioned your gender, as we didn't. We didn't in those days. But then as you started to go into that sort of thing, and now this is your life purpose, isn't it? To inform people and help people understand. So
Yeah.
I just want to hear from you. So how tell me in your own words how that came about and what that means to you today.
Yeah, great. Okay. So my background is corporate. So I was a senior manager in the corporate world for about 15 years, actually kind of about 20 actually, but on and off,
Yeah,
about 15 years in the corporate world, senior manager. And I was in very male dominated industries,
yeah,
which makes a lot of sense to me now because I've got a lot of what I would call yang in me. What other
yes,
people might call masculine traits, I would call yang, not
yeah,
masculine.
yep,
Um, but yeah, and so it was interesting for me because I definitely noticed that I was being treated differently to my male colleagues.
yeah, yeah,
And so things like golf days, I wouldn't be invited. Curry nights, I wouldn't be invited. So I was part of a sales team that was all men apart from me. And I would kind of question, well, why can't I come on the curry night? I like curry. Why can't I come and play golf? I've been having lessons. Why can't I?
yeah,
So
yeah,
it was interesting. And it's when I left the corporate world, I think it was definitely one of the reasons I left. It
yeah,
felt like there were disparities and inequalities between how I was being treated and how others were being treated. So I came out of that. But what I then started doing is kind of like my degrees in psychology. So I've got a first class degree in psychology, and I'd always been fascinated actually by gender as a construct,
yes,
that whole concept of social constructs and what they are. And the more I started looking into the biological differences between men and women. Are
yeah,
we really that different? Is this different in treatment justified?
yes,
Does my brain, does my anatomy mean that I am fundamentally different to
yeah,
somebody who is assigned male at birth?
yeah,
And it didn't take long, David, for me to find myself in parts of the back end of the internet and all sorts of other places with biology professors and
okay,
consultant pediatric urologists, and a lot of people who were pointing out that quite clearly, categorically, scientifically, physiologically, biologically, we're not biologically a binary species.
no,
Not in any way, shape, or
no,
form. So, not on the level of genitals and gonads, not on the level of chromosomes,
yeah,
not on the level of hormones, and definitely not on the level of behavior. And when we look at
yeah,
some of the brain science studies, it kind of shows that really, in a way, there is no such thing as a male brain or a female brain. And there are
yeah,
so many different variables. We're so complex, which we know,
yes,
And so it was this idea that it's quite reductionist to
mm,
decide that there are two different types of human. And so the
mm,
more I investigated it, the more I kind of understood the truth. And to
yeah,
start with, David, I wasn't looking at myself. I didn't turn that
no,
learning
no,
back on me.
no,
I was looking at it with relation to other people and thinking, gosh, these, people who are gender diverse, gosh, isn't this crazy that we can't accept them given that
yeah,
biological sex isn't
yeah,
binary? And then I was looking at cultures around the world and nature and finding all these examples of how sex nor gender are really binary things.
yeah,
And yeah, it was only gradually that I started to then turn that kind of like lens on myself and started joining some dots and going,
yeah,
wow, okay, that's interesting.
yeah.
And so I think I just hinted there, and I'm taking a long time to answer this one
No,
question,
no,
but
you're fine.
yeah,
It's
this
really
like
interesting.
Great. This idea of yin and yang. So I no longer refer to masculine and feminine because I
Mm,
think this construct of masculine and feminine has been overlaid a bunch of stuff that it shouldn't
yep,
have been. And there's a lot of big generalizations that actually, when we dig into them, aren't true. And so I wouldn't say that I'm masculine, but I would say that I'm a very yang assigned female at birth
yeah,
person. So
yeah,
my tendency in the world, my kind of blueprints, the way that I am, would probably be more closely aligned if we were to analyze me and, forget my genitals and my gonads. I'd be more yang, more
yeah,
male. I'd be on that side of the
yeah,
fence.
yeah,
And so when I started digging back through my childhood, a whole bunch of experiences and
yeah,
everything else, it was like, gosh, this makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, it
yeah,
was a professional journey, but it's become a personal one as well. So I now identify as non-binary. Um, yeah, I think once you've researched all the stuff that I have, it becomes quite difficult to continue to stick in the box.
yeah.
So yeah.
Look, isn't that amazing? I mean, I was fascinated only yesterday or the day before. There's a guy who writes on the internet. He writes on medium.com, and he writes a lot about the Christian religion, particularly evangelicalism and so on. But he wrote this fascinating article about the depictions of Jesus throughout artistically, so in sculpture or in paintings and so on. And most of them were commissioned by what we might term homosexual or gay artists. And most of the depictions, if you go back through it, show a, well, quite often they're a nearly naked man, and none of them look like your typical macho man, you know. And so it's just fascinating that in the article, the way he approached it was to say, well, the churches have traditionally, pushed the binary, so this is how a man's meant to be, this is how a woman's meant to be, but the central figure of their faith is sort of in between. He's
What's really interesting,
he
and I
just
found that out this Christmas, David. Sorry, this is
go ahead,
fascinating.
go ahead.
Frankincense and myrrh. So frankincense is associated with yin and
Oh,
femininity,
okay.
and myrrh is associated with yang and masculinity. And
Isn't
so
that
the
interesting?
gifts of frankincense and myrrh to
Yeah,
Jesus were actually a wish from the kings, or the
yeah, yeah,
what do they call magi?
yeah.
It was a gift to wish that he would be non-binary. It was
Isn't
kind
it
of like, may you
interesting?
be the perfect balance of yin and yang. May you be balanced. May you be. And actually, interestingly, when we dig back into ancient cultures, we
Yeah,
find that people who were this balance of yin and yang, that was considered to be the absolute, that
yeah,
was the
yeah.
real thing. We now, like, Grease the movie, kind of like
Yes,
we
yes.
really prioritize these yang assigned male at birth people and the yin assigned female at
Yeah,
birth people.
yeah,
But that's not how we've been historically
no,
at all. It was the
no.
people that walked the middle line that were revered, and the better balanced you were in terms of your yin yang balance,
Yeah,
the more close to God you were believed to be, because God traditionally is non-gendered. God is not a gendered being. And actually, when we look at the kind of like that idea of the like the three parts of God,
yes, yes.
actually there's this idea that God embodies the yin, the yang, and the neutral. It's this kind of, so it's very interesting when we dig back and look at our cultural and religious history, and
Yes,
we find that, yeah. And similarly at the moment there's a big move in, I'm quite a spiritual person, not
okay.
religious but
Yeah,
spiritual. And there's a big move at this idea of the divine masculine and the divine
yes.
feminine. And
Okay.
to me, Jesus is divine masculine and Jesus is very yin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Isn't that interesting? And then
yeah.
to me, divine feminine, there's a lot of people, kind of like playing the role of divine feminine as if it's
Yes.
very yin and it's very soft. And for me, divine feminine has got yang. Divine
Yeah,
feminine is, it's got
yeah,
power. So it's almost like that balance of the female body with the yang, or the male body with the yin,
yeah.
and it's that combining. And priests in ancient cultures, if they were a assigned male at birth person, they would wear the traditional dress of women to
Yes,
conduct the ceremony. And if they were
yes.
assigned female at birth, they would wear the traditional dress of the men to conduct the ceremony.
That is
This
interesting.
concept of yin and yang being something that we're meant to balance, we're
No,
not meant to live at the extremes, we're meant to be in harmony in the center.
no.
When we dig back through our entire cultural history, it's yeah, that's where it comes back to. So yeah.
I've actually for some time now, I've been thinking that, even our constructs of verbal constructs in regard to, a gay person, a heterosexual person, a trans person, whatever, is actually, they're actually wrong in a sense, because again, that creates the different binaries. Whereas you look at, apparently, I've interviewed a couple of ancient theologians who look back into Middle Ages and before, and these
Yeah.
guys talk about the Jewish, the Hebrew heritage, which basically didn't have, any concept of homosexuality as a person, but
Yes.
but people were on, as we understand scientifically now, on a spectrum, and they appear on that spectrum in different places, and it doesn't matter where they are. It's not what you do, but how you treat and respect others that matters most. Um, Shay, sorry, do you want to comment on that? Because I'm interviewing you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Carry on. Yeah, no, go where you were going to go next. Yeah,
All right,
yeah, no,
good.
it's good.
My next point is I wanted to ask you about a typical situation. So you're called in by a company, right? A large company, to address these issues and help them understand, in their culture, how to cope with people of, whatever spectrum, shall I put it in those
Yes.
terms? Is that how, just take me through it step by step how that happens, and then what you address?
Okay. So I think, I mean, wherever we find kind of intolerance or
Yeah,
hatred,
yeah,
it's usually because of some kind of ignorance or
yes,
misunderstanding,
yes,
so, and we find that, regardless of what the difference is we're talking about, it's usually a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge. So I've spent 6 years researching this, in depth.
okay,
And so I've got lots of examples from nature, lots of different cultural examples. I've got quite a
yeah,
rich understanding now of this whole thing. So what I offer to companies, it's like if they were to start from scratch and try and understand it for themselves. I mean, it took me 6 years. So,
yeah,
so in
yeah,
the same way that any expert would go in and say, "This is my area of expertise. Let me help you understand." And so, I've heard a lot of kind of slightly distressing stories, really, about organisations and schools where the people trying to put policies in place or explain
yeah,
it don't know what they're talking about. And
no,
so they're actually spreading misinformation, really, really quite badly.
yeah, yeah,
And so, yeah, what I do is it's when a company gets to a point, it's like, no, we need to understand this. We're trying to write policies and procedures about something we don't understand.
yeah,
It's like, so
yeah,
I love it when companies contact me because that tells me that they're a responsible and ethical organization that are trying to inform themselves in order to write good policy.
wow,
So yeah, so I generally I often get asked, "Will you help us with policies and procedures?" And I kind of like say, "Well, I don't really need to. Actually, you'll be able to do it yourself once you've had
yeah,
my training.
yeah,
I don't need to do that. It's not my area of
yeah,
expertise. I'm not HR trained. I'm not legally
no,
trained. I have my views on
yeah,
HR
yeah,
and legality, but yeah, so what I generally do, it's quite simple. My signature talk is an hour long, and that just really takes people through a summary of my research over the 6 years, kind of what
yeah,
I've learned, what I now understand, and how for me it's quite clear. And I present all the evidence that biological sex isn't binary, and certainly gender
okay,
identity is not
yeah,
binary, never has been. And what that does is it changes the conversation. So
okay,
I usually go into an organization where there's a bit of that binary thinking we have on so many issues in our
yes, yes,
society.
yeah,
You're either for it or you're against it. It's not,
yeah,
there's no gray, is
yeah,
there? We're so black and white and binary in our thinking on everything.
yeah,
So I usually go into an organization where there are people who are gender diverse or who know gender diverse people, who have
yep,
gender diverse family and friends. And then there are people who have been through the standard schooling system, have been taught
yeah,
what they've been taught, know nothing different to that, and think that this is a load of absolute nonsense, and so are railing against it. And yeah,
yeah,
this is ridiculous. And these people are like, well, no. So I go in and I essentially deliver my talk to everybody.
yep,
And I usually find, David, truthfully, that I start, I turn on my camera or I walk into the room and there's several people sat at the back with their arms folded, looking really unhappy about being in this training session on this thing that they don't like.
yeah,
And by the end of it, what I find is they are the people who come up to me and shake my hand or send me a direct message afterwards, follow up with me and express, they're the ones that express most gratitude. Because actually, I don't think any of us want to be ignorant. I don't think any of us want to not understand. And actually, what I'm finding is that defensive aggression that comes from
Yeah.
people who, gender critical, or I think
Yeah.
there's a new phrase now which horrifies me, gender realists. Once they understand, it softens it all. It takes the
Yes.
heat out of it. It
Yeah.
takes the rise, because the rise is only there because they don't understand. Once they understand,
Yeah.
they're usually so grateful. They go, I get it now. Now I get it. Now I
Yeah.
get it. And now I
Yeah.
understand. And what's really interesting is in that process, it just is, it very quickly breaks down some of those conditioned ideas and constructs they have, and
Yes.
helps them step into the world with a new lens, new perspective, and a new kind of understanding. So yeah, that's what I do in the main.
Oh, look, that's wonderful. That's fantastic. You break down the fear barrier, don't you? Because it's fear that motivates people, and fear that stops the empathy, to try and understand someone else and be
Yeah,
kind, you know.
yeah.
Um, can you explain to me, and I think I've got one person who watches this. No, there's more than that. But can you explain why we are not biologically made as one thing or another?
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah. So we kind of have this idea almost that in the uterus there is a pink slide and a blue slide, and that very, very early on in embryonic development we
I love it.
disappear down one or the other, and that
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
it. And then that the entire embryonic development differs from that point, and you
Yes,
either get
yes,
developed as a boy or you get, and it's not true. So embryonic development in terms of sex and gender sex is an interesting thing. If we think about the fact that men, assigned male at birth, people have nipples, you don't need
yes.
them,
No,
but you have them, and you have them because the development of the baby in the uterus, there's a point at which it's still not actually really sexed,
yeah,
it's kind of
yeah,
like, so we all get a little bit of everything,
yeah,
and so I specifically refer to one absolutely incredible study, which was done by 6 independent scientists, and they looked at the global data across the entire world, every single bit of data that they could find and get their
yes,
hands on, and it was a very, very thorough analysis. 6 independent scientists. And they came to the conclusion, so I don't know. I mean, I'm starting off here without actually saying, but there are a group of people who are intersex, which means that
yes,
they're not actually physically born male or female. They're born
yeah,
something else, and it's like,
yeah,
well, what is this? But this study was looking at the incidence of intersex. So, how
yes,
often does this happen in our society? How many people actually are not biologically male or female?
yeah,
So biologically male or female would be XX, so female chromosome, which would then lead to high levels of estradiol, estrogen, female
yep,
hormones, which in turn would then mean that we would have female genitalia and gonads, so
yep,
vagina and ovaries.
yep,
Male would be XY, high levels of testosterone,
yep,
penis and testes. And so
yeah,
that's what we would call biologically male or female. Those are our scientific definitions of
yes,
biological female and biological male. This study showed that between 1 in 50 and 1 in 1,000 people are not born male or female. So for whatever reason, they don't fit into that ding, 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 ding kind of thing. So something has
mm,
happened in their development, in the embryonic development in the uterus, that leads to them being born not male or female according to our scientific
yes,
criteria, the ones that we decided on. So that blew my mind for a start. It's like, whoa, what even is this? And when we look at that, within that, so say 1 in 50, I mean, 1 in 50 is the same number of people who have red hair, for example. It's a lot of people. So if you imagine filling in a passport form that says, what color is your hair? Is it brown? Is it black? Is it blonde? And you're like, well, no, it's red. Well, hard luck. That's not an option on the form. And that's what happens to intersex people
yeah,
all the time. I'm intersex. I'm not male or female. I'm intersex. And
yeah,
in a lot of cases, intersex people do end up presenting as male or female, and to all intents and purposes to the world, they appear male or female. But truthfully, the truth of our complex biology, which is
mm,
way more than the existence of a dangly bit of flesh or not,
sure,
when they actually look at that, they're not actually, they don't fit the full thing. And so when we then look at, well, what does that really mean? We find out that a minimum of 1 in 1,000 babies, but it's actually more like that 1 in 500. And in the UK, the last stats I saw, 1 in 350
wow,
are being operated on at birth to make them male or female.
yeah,
So they are not born male or female, but our construct, our scientific construct that we've overlaid on humanity, we're so bought into it that a baby is born and doesn't fit that construct. We go, we've got to make it fit that construct.
Mm.
And when we look at the incidence of intersex as we go back through history, the
Mm.
Kabbalah, the Talmud, ancient Judaic texts, they
Yeah.
refer to intersex people like they're totally normal.
Yeah.
Cultures in the middle of Indonesia, small tribes, they have names for intersex people.
Yes.
It's been known throughout our history that intersex people exist. And so, yeah, it's really interesting when we come to this idea that actually, we are a biologically binary species when we really aren't. And there's a great quote that I give from a chap called Imran Mushtaq, Dr. Imran Mushtaq. He's a consultant paediatric urologist working at Great Ormond Street in London, which is one of the biggest children's
Yep.
hospitals. And he's specifically looking at differences in sexual development. So people that don't fit those two things.
Yes.
And his final kind of summary statement is absolutely, sex isn't binary in any way.
No.
And we're slowly coming to understand this. So not on a chromosomal level, not on a hormonal level. And so, yeah, one thing that a stat that people find interesting is 7 in 1,000 female athletes have internal testes.
Really?
And a lot of them don't find this out till they get to the track
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
about to compete. And someone says, well, let's just check your testosterone. And it's like, whoa, your testosterone's through the roof.
Oh,
That then sparks an investigation, which turns out that this athlete actually has internal testes.
wow.
That they may not have even known, David, which
No.
is
No.
quite an
No. Of course.
interesting thing. But Semenya, Casa Semenya has just actually kind of won a high court battle to not be discriminated against on the
Yes.
basis that she is intersex.
Yeah.
But there are lots more intersex people in the world than we might believe. So 1 in 50 is a huge number, obviously, but certainly between 1 in 5, well, 1 in 350 and 1 in 1,000 are being operated on at birth to make them fit. Well, I was going to say a scientific construct, but it's kind of, is it a scientific construct or is it a religious construct?
Yeah.
It's a
probably
construct that we're bought into, that we're binary. Yeah.
I would suspect that it's probably a religious concept, but I mean, I'm not really in a position, I suppose, to say that. But I didn't obviously understand this sort of stuff until something is presented to you, and it was actually a book of the American progressive Bishop Spong, who went in one of his books talked about intersex people. And
Yes.
I remember thinking at the time, I thought, wow, I mean, how cruel has our world been, to expect somebody to be different to what they are, I mean, yeah. So that's
David, I had one gentleman in one of my talks. This really illustrates it to me.
yeah.
I could kind of see him hailing a little bit and looking a bit fidgety and a little bit uncomfortable. And I thought, oh, he's not liking something about what I'm saying, and I wonder what that is. And afterwards, he came up to find me and he said, your talk has been interesting, but I must admit I'm a little bit weirded out and wobbled at the moment. And it turned out he was about 65, in his mid-60s.
Yeah.
And when he was born, he didn't have a lot of testosterone in his system.
Okay.
So for
Wow.
65 years, he's been being injected with testosterone because the doctors told him that he wasn't right. He's a boy, he's got a penis, so he should have high testosterone. So he's been, just going because he believed, the medical people, that he must have testosterone, So he's been going and having his testosterone injections. And as he said to me, it was like, who am I really?
Yeah.
Who actually am I? Who would I have been if they hadn't decided that I had to fit into the box?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he's now questioning his whole life. And it's funny, I'm sure there have been other people. He was just one that came to tell me. But yeah, it's really interesting. And when we look at some of the stories about intersex people, there are amazing talks, by the way, TEDx talks. If you search TEDx intersex, there's some amazing examples. Some of people whose parents made the decision to have their genitals altered at birth, who have then had a life of serious mental health issues, because actually how they are on the inside is not the way they were made to be on the outside. It's almost like they got it wrong. The parents made the wrong decision. They chose pink when this person's actually blue on the inside, or they chose blue and this person's actually pink on the inside. But then there are other stories about intersex people who weren't operated on, who are living very, very healthy, happy lives as proud intersex people, having perfectly functional relationships. So yeah, it's a very interesting story when we look at it. And those people who've been allowed to be intersex, and haven't been interfered with, the outcome is generally much, much better than those that were interfered with at birth.
Oh, wow. That's astounding. I mean, it reminds me of so many different people that you see, and when you see somebody who goes through a sex change and they talk about how, if it was somebody male at birth, and the only time they feel alive and real and close to what's in here is when they're
Yeah,
dressed, in a dress and, and so on. I mean,
totally.
we are, you said earlier, and I've often thought of this, we are such complex creatures. We tend to think that, we're just this and that and the other thing, but we're not. It's so complex, isn't it? You're doing
Yeah,
such
and
important
interesting.
work.
You talk then about the trans internal experience, and
Mm,
that's fascinating. There was a groundbreaking study done in 2019 by Lehman and Thiessen, I think are their names. And that was fascinating. They've essentially shown that there is a physiological difference that we can test for in trans people.
right.
So actually the difference in the brains is to do with the estrogen signaling pathways in the brain. And
Yeah.
going back to that uterine embryonic development in the uterus,
Yeah.
um, it's generally thought that what is happening is that genitals and the brain develop at different points in the womb.
Ah,
So
okay.
what actually happens is at some point when the genitals are being developed, the
Yeah.
uterine environment is one way,
Yes.
and something might happen to the mother, to the external environment around the pregnant person,
Yeah.
that actually then affects the uterine environment and the hormone levels in it, so that when the brain then comes to be developed, the uterine environment has changed and the brain develops the other way. So
Wow.
this is what becomes really interesting. So when they did this study, I mean, what's interesting, it was, more studies need to be done. This was,
Of
just one
course.
study that I'm quoting here. But what was fascinating was the statistical significance of this study. Every person that reported as trans and said from 2, 3, 4 years old, I've known I'm in the wrong body and I'm being treated wrong. I'm being treated like this, but I'm not this.
Yes.
Every single one of them showed these differences. I think it's about 19 different genes in these estrogen signaling that relate to these estrogen signaling pathways. Every single one of them had these differences. Whereas cisgender people and all the, kind of the people who were there, the control group of cis people,
Yeah. Yeah.
i.e., were assigned male at birth that are still identifying as male, or assigned female and still identifying as female, they didn't have these physiological, biological, scientific differences in
Wow.
their brains. And so the trans experience is rooted in biology and physiology. It's not a construct. And so I think that's one of the things in my talks that makes a big difference for people. And I've actually been looking recently at some studies about, who generally accepts trans people and who doesn't. And one of
Yes.
the big differences is when people understand that trans is a biological and physiological difference that is evidenceable, it's kind
Yeah.
of, we can prove it,
Yeah.
with a scientific test.
Yeah.
When they understand that, suddenly their empathy, their compassion, their understanding, their desire to actually support trans
Yes.
people changes dramatically. Because I think sadly people have it in their head that a little girl that plays with trucks is just a girl that plays with trucks, they're not trans. Or a little boy that wears a ballet skirt, it's just a boy wearing a ballet skirt. It's not. And do you know what? There are cisgender boys who want to wear ballet dresses, and there are cisgender girls that want to
Yeah.
play with trucks. So
Absolutely.
that's absolutely fine. And boys can do what they like, and girls can
Yeah.
do what they like, and we should stop telling them what they should do. But there is this other group of people in the middle here, these trans people, who, they may want to play with trucks, they may not, but they are definitely, their internal physiology does not match their external physiology. So there is a difference
Wow.
between the outside and the inside. And then when people are saying these people are male, it's like, well, are we really wanting to define people according to a dangly bit of flesh? Or actually is what's going on in here and on the inside more important? And so
Yeah.
it's things like, I started off actually in the corporate world training people in stress management.
Okay.
So it's quite a good jump as an analogy. It's like, we know with stress and mood,
Yeah.
that serotonin, noradrenaline, oxytocin, all of these things vary, they fluctuate,
Yes.
hour to hour, day to day, week to week, year to year. How we feel on the inside changes in response to our external environment and all sorts of different
Yeah.
things. And it's funny how we have this idea that whether you're born with a penis or without one, somehow your entire internal experience is static from that point. And it's like, it's not. Our internal experience is a fluid, changeable, experiential thing that is much richer than the existence of a piece of dangly flesh or not. And it surprises me that, you know, people would rail against that. And I find it funny as well when people who really don't like the inequalities between men and women in this world fight to keep binary gender in place. And I find it hard to not understand how they can't see the logical disconnect. Because
Yeah.
for me, how we get rid of gender inequalities between men and women, let
Mm,
alone any
mm.
gender diverse people, it's through the dismantling of binary gender as a construct. That's how we're going to achieve gender equality. And it's
Yeah.
gender equality cannot come out of the binary gender system, because we will always be this group versus that
Yeah.
group. We're in this binary like model, and it's not binary. But B, yeah, that it's just we're never going to resolve it from within that paradigm. So it's only when we put that down that we can find a new way of understanding gender. So I think there's a lot of call at the minute for us to help young boys kind of embrace feminism. And I'm like, I think we're going the wrong way here. I think
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think we've got this wrong. We need to put down that feminism has been great. It's done a lot
Yeah.
for leveling the
Yeah.
playing field between men and women. But I think now that science has caught up and we have all of the evidence about the
Mm,
rich history of our culture, and we can
yeah.
see that, you know, binary gender was a religious construct actually that was
Mm,
introduced with colonialism. You know, that is what actually
yeah.
happened. Colonization brought binary gender to a lot of these
Yeah.
places around the world and enforced it. When we can kind of like break that apart and we can see that actually we are all unique, incredibly unique individuals with a whole bunch of different propensities and things going on. If we can accept that we are actually individuals, then that changes everything. And yeah, it gets rid of this gender inequality, because when we're not just talking about two, we're talking about a spectrum. Oh, it's just, yeah, much nicer place to view each other from.
It actually it the trying to make everybody fit into those two boxes makes the world a very it damages our psyche as a species, shall I say? You know, I wonder, you know, lots of these things, you know, we look at the world today and there's so terrible wars and horrible things happening. And yet what we're talking about here is science, right? We're talking about respect, um, empathy, you know, accepting each other for whoever we are and whatever we are. Now, if only we had that sort of attitude, then who's going to impose a view that, you know, I want that piece of land, you know, that belongs to my nation, you know, and I'm going to kill whoever I can to get it. Anyway, it's bizarre, isn't it?
It is.
I'd love to keep talking because there's so much, and I'm really fascinated by all of this. Um, but I'd like to finish on the First Nations peoples. So, you
Okay,
know,
yeah.
we know about the approach you've mentioned. Well, we know how Thailand is with its views. We know the American Indians used to venerate, you know, they're two-spirit people. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, it was a way of expressing two-spirit. It's almost binary too, but it's trying to express something that is very deep and profound. But those people were very gifted, and the culture needed them, didn't they? Have you done much research into that sort of stuff?
So yeah, I mean, specifically the Pacific Islanders. Actually, I've been speaking to some people there. So there's a some of the youth are trying to look back into their cultural history and
Okay.
understand, you know, what is our history of gender and sexuality? You know, what
Okay.
is our history? And what's very interesting there is that they've been colonized three times by the Spanish, by the Japanese, and by Americans.
Yeah.
And so a lot of their islands are covered in military bases. Every single one of the colonizing groups brought their own version of what we should and shouldn't be doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so have essentially suppressed what was happening prior to the colonization.
Yeah.
And one of the things that seems particularly cruel is they took away their language. And so language is brilliant. So at the moment in language, you know, there's a lot of people complaining about the explosion of labels, but it's like our language was much richer around all of this. But with the
Yeah.
binary construct, we've lost so much
Yes.
rich language.
Yes.
And so this group of youth in the Pacific Islands are trying to rebuild their cultural heritage. And what they're discovering, two things that are fascinating for me. One is that gender was never considered solely the thing of the individual. So it's like we're born with a propensity. So we might be born in a female body,
Yeah.
and we might be very yang. We might be born in a male body, and we might be we might be in a female body very yin, or in a male body and we might be very yang.
Yeah.
But actually, there's this whole other richness that happens that it's people might be born like they might be born in a male body but be very yin. They might be born in a female body but be very yang, or they might be this yin yang mix in the middle. And so that their understanding is that. So, but then that individual, so that's your own propensity as an individual, but then you're born into an ecosystem. And so if your tribe that you're born into on that day, let's say there was a war and all the people with penises went away and died, and so
Yeah.
we're now a very heavily female yinny
Yeah.
kind of like group, and I'm born and I am a nice yin yang balance. I can actually go either way. Well,
Yeah.
this society needs me to play yang, actually, because there's not enough yang
Yeah.
here,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we're trying to balance yang.
Yeah.
So this is where we might see how people who walk that line between and who are the yin yang, so the intersex people, the trans people, the
Yeah.
non-binary people,
Yeah.
the gender fluid people, they were lauded and celebrated because
Yes.
they could actually play. It's almost like a blood group, you know, the blood
Yes.
groups that can be given to anybody versus the ones that are very specific.
Yeah.
It's almost like a female yin person would be a bit of a disappointment, and a male yang person, they're a bit stuck, aren't they? But these ones are fluid. This is a great one because in our society, whatever happens over the next 20 years, this one can play whatever role we need them to. So this idea of gender being something to do with the individual, but also with regards to the ecosystem that we're born into. So that's one thing that I find very interesting about the way that they saw gender and sexuality
Yes.
and all of those different things. But the other thing that I found particularly interesting is that it's actually the old people from within the local cultures
Yeah.
that are enforcing binary gender
Yeah.
because of the punishment that they received
Yeah.
at the hands of the colonizers for trying to be anything other than.
Yeah.
So this youth from the Pacific Islands are going, no, our culture's rich, our culture's this, gender is not binary, da, 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 da. And they're trying to this resurgence, but the people who are pushing back
Resisting.
against it are their grandparents who are saying, no, you've got it wrong, because the missionaries were so strong in their teaching, and there was a lot of punitive kind of element and shaming.
Yeah.
That this has become so ingrained in the older populations. So it's interesting that the youth they're kind of wanting to bring their grandparents on board. Don't you remember? Wasn't it like this? Didn't we have? And the grandparents are just shutting down all the conversations and don't want to hear it. So it's a very interesting thing. But that story is mirrored throughout the world, actually, that idea that, kind of the yin yang, the balance of, and this idea that gender is a construct that really is an individual and the ecosystem or the tribe or the community in which they are. Fascinating stuff.
I've come across a similar thing, Shay, in the work with Humanity in Need, Rainbow Refugees, that in Uganda, for example, which has a horrendous law, the work that I'm doing, if I was in Uganda, I could probably go to jail for 15 years just because I'm trying to help people who are thrown out of their families. There are situations where a father will kill son or daughter, and the reason they do it is because of the pressures of the community. They will lose their livelihood, all the rest of it, if they don't act really, fiercely against the gay boy or the lesbian girl or the trans person. So these are things that are terrible. And of course, what they do is that firstly, it was the missionaries, and now it's the American, primarily, I think American, been some Australians and English and so on, TV evangelists who are preaching hatred against anyone of difference. And so what the message that is reverberated back from the communities is, we don't want this Western construct of, homosexuality or lesbians or trans people. This comes from the West. Whereas, same as what you've just talked about, you go back in history and there wasn't the issues. The issues weren't there. So, Shay, look, it's been wonderful talking to you today. I think you're doing fantastic work, and I'll obviously keep following you. And at some stage, maybe we'll do this talk again. But
Lovely.
I just feel there's so much to talk about. But I'm really grateful for your time today. And I will finish with just a little appeal to those who watch, that if anybody is able to help us in our work, we're trying to save lives in Africa, trying to help people. At the moment, the Kakuma, this is the beginning of 2024, and the Kakuma refugee camp, the UNHCR is saying that they cannot protect the LGBTIQ people who are there from the other groups. They're not safe. So they're actually sending them to South Sudan, and there's a war going on there. We have heard mixed stories of some people being moved out of South Sudan to maybe Canada or somewhere like that, which is wonderful. But there are a lot that fall by the wayside. So our work is really about advocacy, trying to change the world, just as yours is, Shay, and a very important work that you're doing. So thank you sincerely for your time today.
You're absolutely welcome. Thank you for having me on your podcast, David. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Shay.